Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I'd like to continue on our journey and exploration through the films released by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2021. And in particular, I'd like to focus on this set, which is called 3 Films by Luis Buñuel. And included in this really great set is that film directed by Buñuel from 1977, and it has been given spy number 143. The name of the film in French is Cet obscur objet du désir, or in English, That Obscure Object of Desire. Film from 1977, Cet obscur objet du désir, and this is from producer Serge Silberman, and based upon the novel La Femme et le Pantin by Pierre Louis. The screenplay is by Luis Buñuel in collaboration once again with Jean-Claude Carrière, and of course directed by the one, the only Luis Buñuel. This is the extraordinary work called That Obscure Object of Desire. Like with all Buñuel's films, this film is one that is subject to a whole range of readings and interpretations and perspectives and outlooks. One of those, I would suggest, is focusing in on the essence of the plot or the story. And one way, therefore, to look at this film is that it is a depiction of this intimate, emotional, human relationship between this man, Mathieu, and this woman, Conchita. And so it could be said in many ways to be a type of love story, or perhaps in more general terms, an intimate relationship, showing us the various events or circumstances or situations, the various points that populate the terrain of the emotional and intimate, the mapping out of the human heart, if you will, as made manifest in cinematic terms through the lens, through the eyes of Luis Buñuel, and the result being, of course, this film, That Obscure Object of Desire. But as we know, like with all other films by Buñuel, any story, any subject matter that is in his hands is subject to a whole range of application of paradox and contradiction, layer upon layer upon layer. It becomes many things at once, and thus making for some very thought-provoking, challenging, absurd, funny, shocking, and quite bold and imaginative storytelling from the great master that is Luis Buñuel. So, what do I mean by this? Well, as I say, this film, I would suggest, leads to a whole range of possible interpretations. One of those, perhaps, could be said to be the fact that as a set of contradictions, we have on the one hand, or on one level, the depiction of this emotional, intimate human relationship between this man and this woman, but on the other hand, we have a film that seems to be upending that sense of the intimate, or going against the grain of what we might otherwise expect from this type of intimate human emotional drama. And so we have certain expectations that we might feel on the one hand, but that are constantly perhaps being provoked or being upended or usurped by the gentle hand that is Luis Buñuel. And so we have this dynamism that is already on display here. This dynamism, I would suggest, comes from a number of sources. First, we have the actual story itself. We have this flashback structure, the storytelling quality of the structure that is showing these characterizations of these two main protagonists, if you will, Mathieu and Conchita. And so through those characterizations, we get already a sense of the paradoxical and the chaotic and the absurd that we have seen throughout the entirety of Buñuel's career. So, for example, let's take the character of Mathieu, played by Fernando Rey. I think we can see that he is from a certain class or social strata. There's a certain degree of wealth that is associated with his characterization. We see this play out in specific plot points, how he interacts with the character of Conchita, what he does for her, and what he expects in return, again, from his perspective, his point of view. And so in those, say, exercises, if you will, or those displays of status, society, class, and wealth, we are getting, like we did in past Buñuel films, like The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie or The Phantom of Liberty, for example, we are getting yet another example or discussion or exploration of the various social conventions associated with that aspect of class and wealth in society. There is an absurdist take to this, which means that we see in the context of this relationship how much or how little those expressions end up being in the long term. We see, again, how these try to play themselves out vis-a-vis his relationship with Conchita. And so I think we see, in an interesting way, these reworkings or this examination of society, class, and wealth, but set in the context of this terrain of an intimate emotional story. And so I find that to be very fascinating, but still very closely connected with what we can perceive perhaps to be some of the quote-unquote social concerns of Luis Buñuel's cinema, especially during the latter period, this period of his career. So that's one thing. The other thing, too, again, if we look at the context of the setting of the emotional relationship, we see the ways in which perhaps the aspects of possession, of control, of obsession are played out in the context of this story. And these lead, I think, to various possibilities and discussions on a broader macro level. For example, the characterization of Mathieu seems to be, perhaps, at least one way of looking at it, him trying to exert a sense of control or authority over the character of Conchita through various machinations of plot. And perhaps that can be seen in a pessimistic point of view, or perhaps that can be seen as yet another expression of, say, his class status, etc. However one sees it, it still is a story that could be said to be one man's obsession with this woman, and what lengths he will go to in order to get what it is he wants, the type of satisfaction he yearns for in this relationship that he is either seeking or is imagining or is otherwise lusting for, and what he ends up getting or not getting along the way. And so from that vantage point, I think we can see various things open up, like the relationship between men and women, the dynamics between the sexes. Sometimes the phrase is the battle of the sexes, but I think another way to describe it would be the idea of domination and control on an emotional level, and how that leads to certain circumstances that are quite significant and grave and very serious. And so we have here, on a very almost psychological terrain, this depiction of, say, the viewpoint of this particular man and his outlook vis-a-vis the woman that is the subject of his story, shall we say, in this film, That Obscure Object of Desire. So we have this psychological terrain that is being played out. That is made so manifest and clear through the other half of this relationship, that is the character of Conchita and how she is depicted. This is one of the most famous aspects of this film, and this is one of the most famous aspects, I would suggest, of Buñuel's cinema overall, which is the character of Conchita as she is depicted in this film. Because as we know, she is played by two separate actresses. It's Carol Bouquet and also Angela Molina. So these two actresses at various points in the film emerge, and they are portraying Conchita. And sometimes we will see one actress playing her in one part of the film, and then another actress playing her in another part, and then returning back to the other actors, and so on and so forth. And then it's played out as though it's a story that the other characters don't see the fact that Conchita is played by two separate characters, or two separate actresses, excuse me. But we do as the audience, or do we? This is one of the most magical things about this film. There is a way in which we see this as obviously different, but through the flow of the film, there is a type of hypnotic, magical quality that I dare say allows the viewer to perhaps see this character, even though she's being portrayed by two actresses, to be one and the same. Or perhaps not. Perhaps there is a further sense of confusion that is being expressed along the way because of this depiction. Whatever the case may be, again, it is open to a whole range of possible interpretations. And one of those, I would suggest, is the intimacy, but also the confusion. The way in which Mathieu as a character is perhaps viewing her, Conchita. Perhaps he is looking at her and he sees two separate versions of Conchita, two separate idealizations of the character, one perhaps based on a type of Madonna-esque quality, another based on an earthy type of sensual sexuality. Whatever the case may be, we have different viewpoints, arguably from the Mathieu perspective, and that could go towards the notion, the psychological terrain, if you will, of the need to control, the need to dominate, the need to possess, the need to obsess. And this could also lead to a type of, dare I say it, an objectification that is occurring once again from the Mathieu perspective, thus leading to, I think, very significant and perhaps disturbing conclusions of interpretation and perspective. But this is, again, another insight into, say, the psychological character and terrain of the Mathieu character, on the one hand, again, as we see it via the depiction of Conchita. Another thing that we can consider is perhaps the opposite point of view. We can see maybe an alternative or perhaps parallel interpretation that is possible, that this depiction, this double depiction of Conchita, could be the Conchita character's perspective on the relationship with Mathieu. In other words, there is this way that Conchita's character, through these various performances, is coming out in these bold, dynamic flashes of independence, of strength, and of resistance in an interesting way, and as well as intimate emotional honesty. I mean, there are moments where she is expressing a type of love or desire towards Mathieu, arguably. There are other moments where it's, I think, very clear that she is expressing a sense of wanting to break free in a certain sense of that phrase. And so there's a type of give and take, a push and pull, if you will, of a retreat and then return, which I think is very much part of the emotional and psychological complexity of the Conchita character herself, thus making this dual depiction of Conchita not just potentially how Mathieu views her, but also how Conchita views the relationship and maybe views him, and also perhaps how she views herself. And if that's the case, I find this type of potentially parallel or alternative viewpoint from a psychological perspective to be utterly fascinating. And that's what I mean when I say that this film seems to be all things at once. It seems to be materializing various points at the same time, thus creating a sense of confusion, of anarchy, of chaos and paradox and contradiction, but at the same time holding true in itself a very paradoxical way, holding true to the intimate nature, the emotional terrain of this relationship between this man and this woman. They have loves, they have fights, they break up, they come back together. There is a sense of an uncertainty. But this is the case with many a relationship in our lives, is it not? And so there is a sense of truth here, while at the same time there being a sense of confusion and chaos. And I think this is one of the great things about Buñuel's cinema. It's a type of cinematic expression of contradiction. And we've seen that this type of contradiction expressed in previous works, Phantom of Liberty, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, and we see it here in this film, That Obscure Object of Desire, but this time perhaps with a focus on, as I say, the emotional and intimate relationship between one man and one woman. And, of course, related to this, we have the world of Buñuel expressed in this film. And when I say this, I mean the outlook on the world, the use of absurd takes that can be linked to comedy and humor. We have other really laugh-out-loud moments. We have some sex comedy type of moments. We have highbrow, we have lowbrow. But this is part of the Buñuel terrain, and he delivers this with such verve and wit and intelligence and style that makes this film utterly compelling and hypnotic and so endearing, I think. And that's always the case with Buñuel's films, but that is certainly the case here with this film. But when I use the word endearing, I don't want to suggest that it is in one sense of the phrase, let's say, heartwarming. I mean, there are moments of intimacy and emotion, yes, but there are also moments of coldness, of chaos, of violence and destruction. And these aspects of the violence and the anarchy are being expressed, of course, through the plot or the story that is involving the terrorist groups that are being displayed here, that are being shown throughout various parts of the film. And this is also a very important point to make. And I think it's also connected to Buñuel's cinema writ large, which is the idea of chaos and anarchy and violence. We've seen these aspects depicted in many a Buñuel film before, in particular The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie and also The Phantom of Liberty. There's this idea of the revolutionary spirit as depicted in those various films, and the use or expressions of violence to link up with, say, the notion of running up against certain class structures, and or expressions of freedom, and or the notion of an equalizing force in the world. And what do I mean? I'll get to that momentarily. But these are the types of things, and others, of course, but these are the types of things that I would suggest are being connected to when violence is being depicted in the world of Buñuel, especially during this final period of his career. And I think that is the case for That Obscure Object of Desire, because what we have is chaos in a world that seems to be one where we want to see, or maybe some characters, or Mathieu in particular, wants to try to apply a sense of order to the world that he sees it. Again, in the context of this relationship, he wants to apply his order, one could argue, in this relationship. But in the world that he inhabits and that we see, there is violence and chaos and destruction that could occur at any moment. This is very important because this seems to be linked to its type of revolutionary or political motivation that is perhaps on the fringes of the film, but also very directly relevant too. When we think once again about the characterization of Mathieu and his social class and wealth, or potentially anyway, there's a certain area of society where he comes from, the suggestion being. And perhaps this revolutionary violent spirit goes contradictory naturally against that type of social strata, which is another way to say that perhaps this idea of violence and destruction, this is in many ways in a frightening, chilling way perhaps, a kind of ultimate equalizer. And what I mean by this is that no matter what part of the class strata you come from, whether you're from the same class that Mathieu comes from or whether you're from the same class that Conchita comes from, whatever the case may be, no matter where you come from in this world of Buñuel and that obscure objective desire, the violence of water, the violence of fire, or the chaos that erupts from these random things, it will affect you no matter what. And so that is in many ways a very frightening reminder of the ultimate equalizing effect of violence. Perhaps another way to say that is, this is yet another example of the ultimate equalizing effect, that is death. So this is also another chilling aspect of this film. And so that's why I try to tread very carefully when I use the word endearing. It is endearing, but there is also a sense of the cold and the chaotic and the chilling results that occur therefrom. And this also leads, and I'll end here, but this also leads to, I think, a final, a really profound note that Jean-Claude Carrière makes in one of the supplements here, which is about the notion of surrealism and cinematic surrealism. And we are reminded, of course, that Buñuel came from the school of surrealism, and this seems to be, in very general terms, this seems to be linked to an expression, if you will, of a type of absurdism, of a type of randomness, and a type of chaos and sense of the illogical as expressed through his films all the way back to the works like Un Chien Andalou and onwards. And so there's this notion that Buñuel, I think quite rightly so, is connected to the cinematic school, if you will, of expressions of surrealism in cinema. And if that's the case, then we have to remember one of the comments that he makes and that Jean-Claude Carrière points to when talking about surrealism and talking about how surrealism could be linked to, for example, depictions of violence. And it's so profound because the idea is that violence as depicted and the randomness of violence could be said to be in many ways another type of act of surrealism. And if that's the case, then perhaps that is another way to say that, if we recall, a way to look at the acts of violence in this film being acts of equalizing, to make all things equal in this state of chaos and destruction. Maybe that's another way to say that the cinema of Buñuel, that is, the cinema of surrealism as expressed through Luis Buñuel's camera and his visuals, perhaps Buñuel's surrealism is another way to get at or to achieve or to otherwise explore the notions of equalization in cinema. So surrealism equals equality. And if we think again, going back to what the story is, if we think about this film as a story that is an intimate love story or an intimate emotional relationship between a man and a woman, what's part of this relationship between Mathieu and Conchita after all? One important aspect is the expressions of equality. How equal are these characters? Is Mathieu trying to be dominating, trying to usurp the sense of equality? Is Conchita, on the other hand, trying to assert her own existence, thus trying to maintain a balance or sense of equality? What is the situation here? This sense of equality, I would suggest, is being expressed on this very intimate level, as it's being expressed at the same time at this very broad sweeping level. Surrealism and intimacy, emotion and absurdity, and the notion of dominance and power, but also equality at the same time. And where do these all meet? We're not sure. It's a swirl of confusion and chaos and anarchy and absurdity, but also a swirl of comedy, of intimacy, of brilliance, of beauty and poetry. And this is the heart of the contradiction of Luis Buñuel's cinema. And that's what makes his film so brilliant. That's what makes that obscure object of desire so brilliant. And that's what makes Luis Buñuel as a whole such an artist to reckon with. So this is the film, That Obscure Object of Desire. So as I mentioned earlier, the Criterion Collection earlier in the year had released this set, 3 films by Luis Buñuel, among which, of course, is this Blu-ray disc, That Obscure Object of Desire. This is at spine number 143, and so this is indicative of the fact that we did see it earlier in Criterion's release history on this DVD release here. And this is based upon what's described as being a high-def transfer. Incidentally, for your information, the booklet that is included as part of the box set, later on page 54, in fact, describes the transfer here for the new Blu-ray as being a new digital transfer, having been created in high definition from a 35mm interpositive and a 35mm magnetic track. The film itself, or the disc itself, also includes a number of really great and informative supplements. And so let me just explain what those are in brief. The first of such supplements is a one-on-one discussion in English with Jean-Claude Carrière. And this is from 2000, the year 2000. It's approximately 19 minutes. And we saw the Jean-Claude Carrière discussion earlier, but it's nice to have it here because we have him talking about working with Buñuel, the process of creating a script or story. Sometimes it would be based on, let's say, an original idea. Other times it would be based upon pre-existing material such as this work, That Obscure Object of Desire. And so we get Jean-Claude Carrière's really insightful comments about working with Buñuel and how those ideas came to be and what the relationship was, the professional relationship was between the two men, how they would spend a lot of time together trying to create various stories. Maybe then it would lead to a certain script being written, or maybe it wouldn't lead to anything being written at all. And so there would be a lot of time that would pass, and they would get back together again. They'd see what ideas they thought about previously. They'd maybe abandon certain ideas but take on others, etc. And so this is a great example or explanation of the creative process that was involved between Jean-Claude Carrière and Luis Buñuel. This is fascinating stuff. And and it's here too that Jean-Claude Carrière makes. He has so many great expressions about the act of creation with Buñuel, and about how Buñuel would describe, say, an idea that was perhaps maybe not so good in the long run. He'd describe it as being, quote, the whim of a rainy day. And he'd talk about the idea that Buñuel seemed to place such importance on invisible work, or another way to describe it is the act of trying to capture something of the unconscious. And this is so profound. And also, among other things, Carrière mentions this quote from Buñuel about how the simplest surrealist gesture, and I'm quoting, consists in going out to the street, gun in hand, and taking pot shots at the crowd. There is something inherently frightening about this description, if you will, of the randomness of chaos and violence. And this is the link between expressions of violence in cinematic forms and expressions of surrealism, because surrealism is another way of expressing chaos. And so if we think of this idea of chaos and violence, I think we see that there is something of a very profound statement that is going on here. And this is something that I was trying to link to when I was trying to talk about the idea of the equalizing force and nature of surrealism, and how that plays into perhaps the notion of equality or lack thereof in the relationship between Mathieu and Conchita. But here I think Jean-Claude Carrière says it or expresses it much more vividly and much more intelligently than I could ever possibly do. So this one-on-one interview is brilliant. So please check it out if you haven't already. The next set of supplements is an examination of excerpts of the 1929 film, the Jacques de Baroncelli film, La Femme et le Pantin. And this reminds us, of course, that that obscure object of desire was based upon the Pierre-Louis novel, La Femme et le Pantin. And this also had been made into a number of film adaptations before this film from 1977, one of which is this 1929 silent film. And so what we get here, we got it here before in the earlier DVD, but we're getting it here as well. We're getting specific scenes that show us the story as expressed in this 1929 silent film, and we get also really interesting comparisons with how they are depicted in the Buñuel film. And so we get a number of scenes, only 3 of them, but these are still very enlightening, and they show us not just what the scenes are as they are played out in the 1929 film, but also how they connect with their corresponding scene in the Buñuel film. And there's a nice description by Criterion of where exactly the scenes correspond to the Buñuel film. So if you're looking for a direct comparison, Criterion provides some really great descriptions in the menu. So really interesting. That's not all, because then we have a documentary which is called Lady Doubles. And this is approximately 37 minutes. This is from the Studio Canal. And this is described by Criterion's menu as being from 2017. I think that's probably a little typo. I think it's actually from 2012. And in fact, at the end of the documentary, you have a little copyright notice, and it says copyright 2012, if my memory is correct. So I believe it's a 2012 documentary, but in any event, it's called Lady Doubles. And this is actually a set of interviews edited together, one with Carole Bouquet and the other with Angela Molina, or Angela Molina. And I say Angela because Carole Bouquet actually refers to her as Angela, and so as they were and are friends, I think it can be Angela, or I think it's also pronounced Angela. But in any event, Angela Molina and Carole Bouquet are being interviewed here separately, but it's again edited together. This is one of the key aspects of this film, is the Conchita character and how Conchita is portrayed. Again, Carole Bouquet has her own portrayal and her own methodology and her own look and her own style. And Angela Molina has her own methodology and style and rapport with Buñuel, etc. This is so fascinating and so enlightening, because we get not just the perspectives of 2 separate performances. We also get the backgrounds as to how this ended up in the first place, because we know, and it comes out in other aspects of the supplements, but there were certain production circumstances that led to this particular depiction. And so we know that this originally wasn't the intention of the filmmakers in depicting the character of Conchita, but due to certain circumstances, it ended up being played by these 2 actresses. And so we have a little bit of that story being expressed here, again from these 2 points of view. And we also have an interesting depiction of their relationship, the relationship between Bouquet and Molina, which is so interesting. And also how they shot the film, how they worked with Buñuel, how Buñuel worked with them, how they view their particular aspects of the Conchita character. They are, of course, the same character, but at the same time, they do express perhaps dual or dueling, or maybe, yes, the word is contradictory, aspects of the same character. And this is so Buñuelian. And to hear their perspectives like this is just wonderful, wonderful food for thought, and as I say, very informative, illuminating, and so enlightening. So this is the documentary called Lady Doubles. Again, I think it's from 2012. And then that's not all, because we get another documentary from 2012. This is called Portrait of an Impatient Filmmaker, Luis Buñuel. And this is focusing on the interviews with very close and intimate associates of Buñuel. And we have the director of photography, Edmond Richard, and then we have assistant director Pierre Larry. And so this is very important because they are talking specifically about the circumstances that led to the casting of Angela Molina and Carole Bouquet in the role of Conchita. And they're speaking specifically of what happened that led to that, how Buñuel and Serge Silberman dealt with the situation, which led ultimately to the casting of these performers in the role of Conchita. So that this set of interviews is very important in the description of the production history. It is also very important because they're talking about Buñuel. They're bringing up some really insightful bits of information about Buñuel, the artist, about how Buñuel seemed to not like to wait around for certain technical issues to get resolved. This is a reference to the quote-unquote the fact that he was an impatient filmmaker. And this, I think, is said in a very intimate way in that Buñuel had a certain concern on set about what he wanted to do with the day. And I think one of the things that Edmond Richard and Pierre Lally express is that Buñuel wasn't necessarily concerned with trying to wait around for certain technical issues to become resolved, but he was really interested in trying to get at what it is he wanted to do as far as the production was concerned. And so they describe him in, I think, very loving terms as a type of impatient filmmaker, thus the name of the title of the documentary. But still, he had a sense of concern and focus that was about precision of where certain movements were in the shooting of particular actors, of the depiction of various scenes, etc. And this leads to the idea or an understanding of who Buñuel was as an artist and as a filmmaker. So this gives us, as I say, the interesting and important production background into the film itself, and also important background into Buñuel, the artist. So, wonderful stuff. Portrait of an Impatient Filmmaker, Luis Buñuel. This is approximately 16 minutes. And then we have what's described as Carrière, Ray, and Silberman. And this is approximately 15 minutes from 1977, Le Monde du Cinéma. And Carrière, Ray, and Silberman refer to Jean-Claude Carrière, Fernando Ray, and Serge Silberman. So the writer, co-writer, collaborator, the star of the film, and then the producer. And they each talk in their own interview. They each talk about the film and working with Buñuel. And there is some really insightful things about, another thing that comes out here like it did in the previous documentary. It was about how Buñuel is so intent on precise movements of his actors and the types of brilliant demands that he had on his performers and what it was that he was searching for. And I think Fernando Rey's comments go to this really precisely and really astutely. And there are some really beautiful images conjured up as well. The example, for instance, that Jean-Claude Carrière gives about how a film is like a cathedral. It's one of the most breathtaking and beautiful metaphors about Buñuel cinema that I have ever heard. And so watch the end of this particular supplement, and you'll get that little description by Jean-Claude Carrière. It is so beautiful about how film is like a cathedral. But anyway, this is Carrière, Ray, and Silberman, approximately 15 minutes. That's not all, because then we get another supplement, which is from 1977, Allons au cinéma, and this is approximately 30 minutes. It's called Remembering Buñuel, and it's a gathering of various collaborators and friends and also admirers and also people in the crew and also some of the actors that were in Buñuel's inner circle, as it were. So we have people like Michel Piccoli and Jean-Claude Carrière and Julien Berthaud and Muni and others. And so this is another wonderful experience to hear these people speak about their working relationships and personal relationships with Luis Buñuel, and they have this great sense of admiration, respect, and awe, and intimacy and friendship with the great master and artist who is Luis Buñuel. It's so great. There's a particular moment where they're describing once again this notion about how Buñuel works with his actors, and he relies on precision and movement and placement within the scene. And the description by one of the participants is it's almost like no Japanese no theater. And I thought that description was so powerful, really powerful, and it goes towards how Buñuel seems to have been focusing in on particular movements, perhaps, and this type of precise design, which is so fascinating. At one point, I think the Criterion menu refers to the fact that Fernando Rey also is participating in this, in essence, a kind of outdoor roundtable discussion, but I don't seem to recall Fernando Rey being in attendance. I know they relied on certain clips from past Buñuel films, and in those clips we do see Fernando Rey appear. But I don't see Fernando Rey, or I don't remember seeing him as part of this intimate round table discussion about Buñuel. Maybe he was there, but I miss it. But I don't think he was there. So, but anyway, the Criterion menu does describe this as being having the participation of Fernando Rey. But in any event, we have this wonderful roundtable discussion again by these people who are in the intimate circle of Luis Buñuel. So it's wonderful to get their comments and reactions in the context of his film, That Obscure Object of Desire, but also in the context of his career overall. So once again, this is Remembering Buñuel. And then the supplements conclude with the trailer for the film, That Obscure Object of Desire. So please check it out if you can. And as I mentioned, this forms part of this set, this box set release from Criterion, which has its own booklet as well. And so I plan to make in a separate video some discussion points about this set overall. So please stay tuned if you're interested. But as far as this film is concerned in its own Blu-ray, this is That Obscure Object of Desire, once again, a wonderful, extraordinary gathering of various paradoxes and contradictions that still have at its very heart and soul the focus on a human relationship, and all the beats and all the confusions and all the feelings of warmth and also the feelings of loss and all that baggage and all that stuff of human experience that is there. It's all here in Buñuel's work, and it's here with such vivid style and intelligence and wit and depth, as with all Buñuel's films. And when you think about how this film falls in the trajectory of Buñuel's filmography, of course it is his final film. And if we recall that, we realize that it is in many ways a film that says so much about Buñuel and his career. And it's also something where we see him as youthful as he was from the very beginning, from Un Chien Andalou. And even in a film like Un Chien Andalou, like with the film That Obscure Object of Desire, we have a story that is in essence about relationships, about the changing dynamics of various people in those relationships. We saw it back then and we see it now here. And so this is yet another example of Buñuel at this part of his career, but it's also very much an example of Buñuel and the power of his cinema overall. This is the film That Obscure Object of Desire. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.